Hello and welcome back to the Tech River, the podcast where we talk about everything to do with tech. Phones, servers, networking, you name it. I'm your host, Justin.
And I'm your host, Tim. And today we're going to be talking about the shiny new M2 chip that Apple unveiled a couple of weeks ago at WWDC. This can be found in the new 13-inch MacBook Pro with Touch Bar and is soon to be unveiled in the redesigned M2 MacBook Air.
Which is coming sometime this month in July.
They promised that at least. It has been reported, however, that the SSD speeds in the base model 13-inch MacBook Pro have been half of what they were with the previous version. And mind you, the new release, which has half the speeds, is somehow more expensive?
Well, they didn't change anything. All they did is put in a new chip and they've made $100 Australian more expensive, which I think is an absolute rip-off.
For slower SSD speeds. That makes no sense to me. And who knows, we might end up ranting on about Apple's naming scheme. I hope not, but it's the inevitable ending.
Well, I mean, we've already done one take and we've already had a problem with the naming scheme, so that sort of says how we're going.
Yes, all the outtakes that you guys don't have to hear. Do you want to explain why it's being so slow, and then I can sort of tell you about that?
So originally, YouTuber Max Tech did some Blackmagic disk speed tests and found that, shockingly, the speeds of the SSD were actually around half the speed, as we mentioned earlier. Now, when they did a few teardowns of these computers, they found that the SSD NAND chips were actually... They're used on the previous M1 MacBook Pro, there were 228GB NAND storage drives. But on the new one, there's only one 256GB NAND SSD, which means that because there's only one chip to be able to write to, you end up with half the speed, whereas before you had the two chips so you could be more efficient and double them up. So that's why it's halved. However, it's important to note that this only applies to the base models, so the higher spec models from 256GB and higher have the full speed SSD, and this was confirmed by YouTuber Aaron Zolo from his YouTube channel Zolotech. I recommend going and checking him out. He's a really good YouTuber.
Very good.
Goes into a lot of detail, but and as well as Max Tech, who did the initial speed test and found this out. But I think we can leave those in the description below, those channel links.
Yes, hopefully we should be able to.
We're sort of learning.
Yes, we're on a new platform as well, so we're sort of just teasing out all the issues.
But anyway, the 512 has 256GB, and then the 1TB has two 512GB NAND drives, which means you have double the storage. So, double the speed. So that's fine. And so if you want to get the full speeds, then make sure you upgrade the storage.
Yeah, or possibly wait for the M2 MacBook Air. However, we haven't confirmed it because we're still waiting for it to be released. Come on, Apple, we're still waiting.
My assumption is that if the Pro suffers from this issue, then I would assume that the Air would as well, considering it's cheaper.
Yep.
However, nothing would really surprise me at this point because
they
have the Air, in my opinion, is a much better package than the Pro. It's got better everything except for the slightly more binned CPU. So, I mean, if I was buying it, I'd definitely go the M2 Air. But
unless you love the touch bar. Love the touch bar.
That might be another podcast later down the track. But, yeah, we still got to wait for reviews on the M2 Air, so I probably wouldn't recommend just pre-ordering it unless you need it straight away, because, I mean, they could sell out quite quickly. But I think reviews are important at this point.
Yeah, mate, especially at the price point that you're going to be paying for one of these computers, you do definitely want to make sure it's a good buy. Even with Apple having their return windows and stuff, I would say it's a hassle at best. I've never used it, but it would be a hassle at best. Anyway, a way that I like to explain the NAND chip thing, I've used this with friends and family and it has worked quite well, is I like to think of it like a water tower. So if you have one 20-litre water tower and one pipe that can do a litre a second, you're going to get 1 litre a second. However, if you split that across 2 water towers that can hold 10 litres each, you now have 2 1-litre pipes, which means you can get 2 litres a second. What this means is that if you have 2 NAND chips, you have double the amount of lanes or buses, which in this RNG would be the pipes. So you can get the information twice as fast because there are 2 chips with 2 separate data access points per se that you can read and write to.
Yeah, actually, that's a very helpful analogy.
Thank you.
That's the first time I've heard that from Tim as well.
Oh, thanks.
I think that makes it easy for someone who who maybe doesn't know as much about this stuff to understand. And as Tim said, his family seem to understand that
Yes.
quite well. All right, so now after that analogy, it leads me on to some possible reasons that Apple may have decided to do this. Now, a lot of you, including myself when I first saw this, jumped to the conclusion that Apple did it because they want more of your money so that they can upsell you on a high spec
Apple
model.
beat Apple.
Yeah, and we've seen them do similar things to this in the past. So that doesn't surprise me if that's the case.
No, it doesn't.
However, I think there's a few other possible explanations. So one of them is that the 128 gig NAND SSDs may not have been getting used all that much in all the different machines because
It's a very specific use case for the base model. So those 128 gigabyte NAND chips, Apple really can only use them in the base model 13-inch MacBook Air and MacBook Pro, whereas they have a lot of other laptops like the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, and then they also have their other computers such as the M1 Mac Mini, the Mac Studio, the iMac, and them being out, they can use their 256 gig chips in a wide variety of devices
with many different configurations. But the 128 were only getting used on the base model because that's the only configuration they could be used in ever since they axed the base model 128 gig back in the Intel. I think that the last one.
Oh, the good old Intel days. That
2019. 2019. So,
I'm so glad we're past Intel.
Yeah. So anyway, but as to whether, the M1 MacBook Air is still on sale for $1,500 Australian dollars.
Yes.
I think that works out to be $9.99 US.
Yeah.
Now, as to whether maybe that's a better deal than the M2 MacBook Air, it's hard to say until we actually see the reviews. But that's got the full fat SSD. So
yeah, and the M2 MacBook Air would also get you a better webcam,
pretty much better everything.
Yeah, pretty much everything. Better keyboard, better speakers. Well, I think, better keyboard, debatable if you like the touch bar. I also want to just add another speculation as to why there is now only the 256 gig NAND chips, and there's only one of them, which, mind you, I don't think we touched on this earlier, but during the teardowns that iFixit and a few other people have done, there are actually the connectors on the logic board for the second NAND chip.
Well, in my opinion, that's just because they haven't changed anything about the machine. So it's quite obvious. But
Anyway, but another thing I want to touch on is that some people have speculated that it may also be because of the ongoing chip shortage, which we have been experiencing for a few years now. And some people have said, it might just be because Apple can't access these chips and it was better for them to just go for the 256 models. As far as I know, and I will update this in the description or comments or whatever it is if I am wrong, but as far as I know at this point in time, Apple has not released any official statements as to why this is.
Unlike the Stage Manager debacle on iPad, where they had a few statements about that, and then they ended up contradicting themselves. That's for another topic.
Yeah, stay tuned for another podcast about Stage Manager and the very long and twisted road that we got there and the strange explanations. Very strange. Anyway, so yeah, I think that could be another possible reason because of the ongoing chip shortages, but yeah, I don't think it was right for them to do it, seeing as you are paying more. But in another way, I do think maybe it was justified.
Look, for base model users, which these computers are aimed at, they're not really going to notice this because when you're just doing web browsing and you're doing just normal application use, you're not really going to notice the difference. It's more when it comes into when you're doing professional workflows that you might actually notice the difference. But really, if you're doing those sort of workflows, then these computers aren't really designed for that. Like the M2 MacBook Air, we already know that the M2 chip runs hotter than the M1.
Yes.
I am concerned. It's in an even thinner chassis than the previous M1 MacBook Air, so there could be significant thermal throttling on that. So
We'll report back later on
yeah,
that.
we'll just have to see the reviews. But yeah, it's sort of hard to know what's a good buy at the moment. So that's what I wouldn't recommend going out and pre-ordering one of these Macs.
No, I would definitely say wait for the reviews to come in. They will pretty much flood in all across YouTube at a pretty similar time as everyone rushes to get their videos out. And like we said earlier, Zolotech, that YouTube channel, I'm sure he would have a video out quite quickly, and it would be a very comprehensive guide. So again, we'll leave his channel link in the description, or pin comment or whatever it is. Again, we're still working this out.
And just as a side note, I think, in my opinion, he does the best coverage of all the software updates, like beta updates and all that, than anyone else on YouTube. So if you're interested in those sorts of things, like living on the bleeding edge and installing the first developer beta on your main device, then definitely check him out. Cause,
yes, you can have a poke around his YouTube channel if you're interested. So I don't actually think we know exactly how long we've gone for. We probably should have started a timer or something. Look at how professional we are. But I think we might wrap it up here.
Yeah, so stay tuned for our next podcast, which we don't actually know what it will be.
It's a surprise. It's a surprise. It might not even be next week. We don't know. It's a surprise. Just leave it at that.
So yeah, thanks for tuning into the Tech River podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Maybe share the podcast with someone that you know if you enjoyed it and you think they'll get some good use out of it. Once again, thanks for listening, and we'll catch you guys next time.